This is the third part of the second lecture. We're going to talk about cultural differences in social cognition. When it comes to schemas and culture, the first thing to keep in mind is that all human beings seem to use schemas. What does change by culture is the content of these schemas, which actually change quite widely depending on the cultural context a person is both raised in and has been living in for a while. Remember that schemas are representations of knowledge, and ultimately common knowledge is dictated by our societies and cultures. This is also one of the primary ways in which cultures and societies exert control on their members, and I don't just mean control in that you have some authoritarian or patriarchal society hierarchy that is controlling its members, but rather the information that human beings are privy to and their habits and patterns are often dictated by the societies in which they live in. And many different societies have a lot of different ways of living, even though many of us continue to try and live. These cultural differences and differences in the schemas that result from them are also one of the primary reasons through which miscommunications or accidental insults can happen when moving from one culture to another. As is often the case, people have all manner of different types of behaviors which might appear strange or foreign to us who are not familiar with them, but please remember that the opposite is true as well. Those whom you look upon and deem that their behaviors are strange, the likelihood is that they look at you in exactly the same way. Now, my opinion here is that this is a wonderful opportunity to communicate across this divide instead of sitting there and giggling to yourself about how someone is strange or odd. For the most part, strangeness and oddness is just a matter of our own limited understanding. Now, one note, if you are traveling, it is important, I believe, to learn at least the basics about the culture to which you are traveling. For example, in some places, it would be incredibly rude to put your feet on a table and show the soles of your feet to people who are passing by. It just would not be done. In other places, looking directly in someone's eyes could be considered insulting or just not an appropriate thing to do. And sometimes they're even simpler things that we take for granted but are wildly different. So, for example, here in the United States, the peace sign is something that is commonly shown. This is just when you hold your palm out with two fingers up. It's kind of like showing these are two, but it is a peace sign because it forms this little V. If you were to turn your hand around such that your palm is facing towards you with your same two fingers up, this would actually mean the equivalent of fuck you or up yours if you were in Australia and the UK. If you would like to look it up, there is a quite funny picture about George W. Bush, the second Bush, who went to Australia, and as he came out of the airplane to which he landed, he stuck out both of his hands and made this reverse peace sign to the entire country of Australia, which was basically like telling them to shove it within 10 seconds of him showing up in the country. It also makes you wonder that they didn't have someone who studied cultures who would be able to tell world leaders about such things. Now, while you don't have to suffer the ramifications of being forever known as a public leader who did something as follyful as that, please be aware that different types of gestures and common knowledge that we take for granted in one culture need not be common in a different culture, and vice versa. One of the most commonly studied differences across cultures is in regard to thinking styles, and these fit under schemas because we oftentimes just default to this way of thinking without really paying much attention to the fact that there's an entirely different way of approaching situations. The first is holistic thinking, and this is a type of thinking in which people focus on the overall context and particularly the ways in which objects relate to each other. Excuse me. This is considered to be most prevalent in Eastern societies, and it also need not just be objects of things in the background, but there tends to be a much greater degree of concern or attention paid to the interaction between members of a community as opposed to individuals within them. A common saying that sort of summarizes this is that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. Conversely, there's analytical thinking, and this type of thinking is in which people focus on the properties of objects without necessarily considering the surrounding context. and this is considered to be more prevalent in Western societies. And again, need not be that they're completely oblivious to the surrounding context, but more information is paid to the direct focus of whatever is present in the visual field or image that is shown. A way of describing this one would be that the early bird gets the worm. Now, there are some interesting differences that happen. One actually that I think is quite entertaining was a marketing example, and Nike, the company that makes shoes and clothes and sports stuff like that, they had this ad for some new type of shoes that showed a single runner just taking a big stride as they flew down ostensibly some road somewhere. And this ad or poster ad was a big hit in the United States, and sales of this shoe went up. And so, of course, they wanted to also expand their markets and wanted to start selling these shoes in China as well. And after implementing the advertisement, sales did not change of that shoe at all. Basically, an ad that worked so well in the United States was a complete flop in China. And so they hired some social psychologists to kind of give them some answers as to why that might be the case. And they said it's because of how people tend to think. In the Western societies, it is the pure goal that one is focused on, that individual aspect, that one runner whom we could ostensibly be like, and therefore those shoes were something we now desired. Whereas in the Eastern culture, this was not really a desirable quality. To be alone is not really something that is valued. And so they changed this ad for China, in which they put a group of maybe 40 people all standing together, all wearing this shoe, and all of a sudden sales went up through the roof. A quick note about Eastern and Western cultures. So some, at least literature that I know of, has said that Latinx folk, even though they could be said to come from Western countries geographically speaking, because all of the Americas are in the Western hemisphere, they do demonstrate more holistic thinking than do people from the United States or Europe, who tend to dominantly show analytic styles of thinking. Now, when we are speaking of Eastern and Western cultures, we tend not to actually be referring to geographical locations, and much more are speaking about the philosophical underpinnings of these societies. And even there, it is oftentimes used in this Eastern-Western dichotomy, where they will say that it's Greek philosophy that influenced Western thought, and Buddhism and Taoism that contributed to Eastern thought. But as far as I know, much of the Latinx communities were not influenced really by either of these two traditions until much more recently in the history of human beings. And so I don't think it needs to be one or the other per se. Rather, it's just an overall cultural difference in whether we tend to focus on individuals more or on communities more. And again, that applies both to objects or people. Now, I personally have not come across literature speaking about African communities, Native American or First Nation communities, or even Pacific Islanders, so I'm unsure where they would fit into this spectrum of analytical and holistical thinking. Also, just one final note, all human beings are ultimately capable of both styles. There are experiments that show that you can prime different contexts that will make it more likely that people from any of these cultures will think more one way than the other. Culture only determines which one we tend to use more commonly or which we will reach for first. It does not change the ultimate underlying capacity of the human mind to be able to consider situations both holistically or analytically.